what do I mean by complications? The first thing is the email ecosystem changes. Think about it like circle of life, right? So somebody opens an email address or signs up for an email address at Yahoo. They start using that religiously. They sign up for a bunch of promotional marketing messaging using that address. Then they realize, gosh, Yahoo's not cool anymore. I should use Gmail or some other provider right now. I'm going to use that instead, and I'm going to sign up for more promotional marketing messages. Meanwhile, I'm not going to pay attention to that Yahoo address. So a variety of things happen after the fact that move that Yahoo address into different, dispositions. And we'll show some examples of that in the next couple of slides. But that's one consideration. Another consideration, and I've had a disturbing number of conversations with clients about this recently with regard to systems. So some of the things that I was just talking about in the preceding slides with regard to, make sure that you're removing your unsubscribes and complaints and that hard bounces are getting filtered and they have business rules around soft bounces. A lot of that, there's a lot of trust involved in that as an email marketer because you probably don't control directly all of the systems that you're asking to implement those rules. Those might be managed by IT. They may be managed really by your ESP in the cloud. And so, you're hoping that those systems work. And I think there'll be a couple of examples of where those systems don't work and where it may benefit from having more of an ongoing approach or, an ongoing audit of those systems to make sure you can really trust them. And then the third consideration that I would offer to you, so I sort of mentioned Safe to Send as, what FreshAddress has in terms of an email protection solution. And, it'd be wrong to think of Safe to Send as a static, or really any, email hygiene solution that we're offering as being a static thing. The reality is data changes all the time. New spam traps are being created. Our knowledge about existing spam traps improves, for example, just taking that as an example. And, the idea that you could conduct a one-time, oh, yep, I did my duty or due diligence on the email address quality side because I did a one-time clean or I conducted a project where I worked on that data quality. That's probably a common way of thinking about it, but it's not the best way of thinking about it. And one of the reasons is that we get better at our jobs. We improve our knowledge of what's happening, and we have a team dedicated to that. And I'll show you sort of what that looks like in terms of real numbers to give you just a sense of how dramatic that is over time. So those are three sort of complications, right? So let's take these in turn and see how they might affect you or affect your confidence in what you think is your best asset, which is your email address file. So changes in the ecosystem, that was our first thing. So what are some of the changes that actually happen? Well, of course, delivered addresses can turn into bounces. Just because, for example, you sent an email and it got delivered today doesn't mean that tomorrow you won't send to the same address and it won't bounce. There are wireless domains, right, that you're not intended to send email messages to. The FCC is in charge of those and may update those. Folks become spam complainers or add themselves to the email preference service list, which is that DMA do not email list. So they may change their minds, right, about how they see promotional email and how they view your own email messaging. Domains can go from accepting email to no longer having valid MX or incoming email records as part of their registrations, and so as part of the DNS record, so they may no longer accept your mail. And then formally good addresses, through a process that I kind of sketched out briefly above, may turn into spam traps. Let's focus on that last one for a second and just go through an example that a client went through recently. So this is kind of a funny example because the timing is just so interesting, but take it that in October, right, a client receives some Safe to Send results. They conduct an email, protection hygiene project with us, and they do a Safe to Send project. And they get some results that some of which are, we say, go ahead, email these, and then some of which we say, don't email these. In November, one of the domains in that Safe to Send file is marked for renewal. And there's nothing particularly dramatic about this. This happens all the time. Ownership of domains is on a certain schedule depending on how much you purchase that for. And so there's nothing particularly special about that, except that later on in that month, the MX server for that domain, which is the incoming mail server, is pointed to what we now know as a spam trap provider. This sequence of events, of course, is happening unbeknownst to the client, and this is all sort of in hindsight, because in December of 2014, right, the client reports a blacklisting, and they come to us and they say, can you take a look at this? And then only in the benefit of kind of looking after the fact do we see sort of this sequence of events happen with that domain. Now, there's more to this story, right, because, of course, email addresses don't recycle into spam traps without a significant period of bounces, so it's possible that there were more bounces in there that somehow the client missed, or that there were a significant period of bounces prior to October 2014, and then suddenly it got switched to a valid MX record at some point. So there's more there, I think, but it just gives you an example of how quickly, given, if you think about your sending cadence, for example, depending on how frequently you send, or depending on the timing of your email hygiene project, you're actually vulnerable to some pretty quick changes in how the email ecosystem is structured. Let me share a few numbers with you in terms of so that was an example of a particularly nefarious, right, spam trap switch, just one example. But what does this look like in terms of numbers? And we've been working with a couple clients, or a number of clients on this, and this is just in sort of 5 months' time. How many email addresses might you expect to sort of flip from previously good to potentially bad and potentially detrimental? And the size of the email files obviously matters and factors into this. But I guess one of the things that I want to encourage you to focus on is not just the raw numbers, which actually I think are pretty impressive by themselves. If you think of 11,000 email addresses on your email file as being potentially, what you thought were good but now are bad over some period of time, that's fairly significant. But really what I want to encourage you to think about is that, kind of the quality or severity, rather, of some of those flips can really affect you. And I just alluded to this in earlier slides in terms of, really depending on what you're sort of emailing to. If you're emailing to a particularly influential provider of blacklist or spam trap services, then your inbox placement can really crater. And so that's definitely an open risk if you think about the fact that even if you think you're sort of removing all that you should remove, or you've conducted a one-time cleaning or something like that, things continue to change in the real world. And if you don't have the benefit of that monitoring, then that's something that can really, take you down, or there's kind of a latent risk that you may not be thinking of. So systems. So that was sort of the second thing that I wanted to draw your attention to as a consideration. So thinking about systems and how they may break or not operate as you intend. And when we think about it, or I guess when we hope about it maybe, we think about systems in a simple way. And what I mean by that is, we have one instance of our email database and it lives here. And I'm going to run safe to send on it. I've been completely convinced by everything Mike is saying about email hygiene and protection, and so I'm going to do that, so that's good. And then, in a sequential order, I send email marketing campaigns, and I'm very good about removing bounces and unsubscribes and calling inactives, and I follow up on that. And this is sort of the ideal view of how data inputs flow to and from your email database. And it's probably an incorrect view, I would hope, actually, if you're, conducting any sort of complex or multifaceted, email marketing program. And the reality is probably that we have multiple instances of our database in different places. For example, you may have a database of record or some sort of on-site database that really is, where the truth lies. And then you're, maybe batch updating or syncing that with the cloud, with the ESP that also houses your email database, which, by the way, is probably taking incoming data directly from web forms itself, which then has to be synced back down to your servers. So you have multiple places where this data is stored. And by the way, you may have transactional information in a completely different place. And then with regard to the types of messaging, it's not that you're sending, one organized campaign after another, but rather, each person on your email list is probably receiving their own particular stream of, messaging from you. Batch and blast is somewhat of a dirty term, but you're probably sending, broader scale email campaigns that what you might think of as more of a proper campaign, I guess. More triggered or personalized messaging depending on the behavior of that person, and then actual transactional or non-promotional messaging, potentially coming from a different sending infrastructure. That's all outgoing information, and then you'll obviously get, bounces or unsubscribes or various feedback from that, opens and clicks, the positive things too. And then other information coming into your system, right, are things like user changes. What if the user, goes to your preference center, which you worked so hard to build, and says, I want weekly emails instead of daily, or you may have information coming back directly from the ISPs. And the ESPs, of course, add to their suppression files on an ongoing basis. So that's just a much more complicated view of all of the data that's coming into your system and going out from your system. And, oh, by the way, the fact that your system is actually in a bunch of different places, and raises the question of whether you're sure that all of these things are operating in harmony. And I've talked to a few clients where they've, mentioned to me, like, yeah, IT assured me we're handling this well. We're removing the bounces that we receive in our email service provider. We're taking them out of our, our terrestrial, not the cloud database, but the one on our system, such that they won't be synced back to the email service provider over time. But really, they realize maybe by checking into this after working with FreshAddress, actually we've been sending a bunch of emails to some of these addresses that really we should have been taking off after some period of time. So just something to think about in terms of a consideration. And then in terms of flagging improvements, this is, where an organization like FreshAddress is going to, this is what we're focused on. This is totally in our wheelhouse, and this is, our core function is to drive email address list quality for our clients so that they can, grow revenue off of that. So you would expect that, we have a team we dedicated to, growing that knowledge base. And as an example, spam traps aren't the only problematic type of address, but it's a particularly, it gets folks' attention when you talk about spam traps. And so just wanted to share with you some recent quarters of activity sort of added to our knowledge base. If you look at 3 quarters combined, we've added more than 500,000 spam traps to our knowledge base over that period. Now, of course, new spam traps are being created all the time, and it would be a mistake to say that any vendor can remove 100% of your spam traps. And if you ever encounter a vendor that says that, run away as fast as you can. But it is, I think it is a real asset to think of a company like FreshAddress as sort of having a team dedicated to this, to where, you have your own metrics, have your own responsibilities. You don't have the time to dig into this data set like we do. And so if you think about, engaging with a company like that to kind of outsource really that global email intelligence and have kind of a partner working for you. So what's the takeaway from all this? I've just suggested, right, 3 different ways in which you might question what you think about email address quality, especially when you think, oh, I'm good, I've taken out all the bouncing addresses, I'm sending to only people who want to receive my email. The real takeaway is if you look at the numbers, up to 6% of your, what you might think of as your good file goes bad over an annual period. And that doesn't include just, working email addresses that don't want to receive your mail. So that doesn't include, for example, unsubscribes, which would be really a separate category, a separate percentage. And you should manage that carefully as well. But this is really just the changes in the dispositions of those email addresses, either through actual changes in the real world or improved flagging on our end, things like that. And they fall into a bunch of different categories. Here's just a snapshot from one client who is working with us over time, if you will. And you'll see that, particularly bad sets of addresses, spam traps are not an insignificant amount of that that are flagged or alerted to those folks. So let me move then